Well, good morning, church. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about what it means to see God, and we've been looking at finding God in some interesting places. We talked about how to see God in our doubts and how to see God in some of the challenges that we have in life, like in our brokenness and in our struggles. And we've been asking you to respond to us on our Facebook page with ways in which you've seen God, and many of you have responded in verbal form and in picture form. So we thought we'd share some of the pictures today of ways in which you have been seeing God. So let's take a look at this. Well, as you can see, we've seen a lot of beautiful images of the ways in which you have responded as the ways that you see God. Well, today we're actually concluding our series, and we're going to be talking about seeing God in the midst of our joy. Now, there was an opportunity for us to talk about a couple of things today, but I wanted us to focus on two in particular things in general. You know, there seems to be two words that we seem to fall prey to. One is the word happiness, and one is the word joy. And what we begin to think is some of us think that those words are synonymous, that if you're happy, you're joyful, if you're joyful, you're happy. But what we're going to learn today is that there are some significant differences between those two particular words, between happiness and joy. Several years ago, a study was asked out of Psychology Today, and they asked the question of 52,000 Americans, and they said, what is it that makes you happy? And here's a couple of the responses that came back with things that make people happy. They said, friends and having people to thrive together with a social life. They said a good job makes them happy. Being in love, recognition, and success, those things make them happy. Personal growth, good financial status, having a house or an apartment, that is something that makes them happy. A marriage, and also your partner's happiness, that's important too. You know, I officiated a wedding last night, and it seems like every wedding premarital counseling is the same. And as we pastors counsel couples in their before they get married, we talk about a lot of different things in the ways in which is to resolve conflicts and how to keep, more than just happiness in a marriage. And it all boils down to, I tell them with honesty, there will be times in your marriage where you're not going to like the person you're married to. And that's just the truth about it. And I always look at the grooms-to-be, and I said, but guys, if we just learn two words, life will always be perfect for us in our marriage. And they look at me like, please give me some wisdom, O great wise one. And I said, and those two words are, yes, dear. But happiness is different, and happiness is actually contingent upon external sources, external events, and it's about things that happen externally to me. And if those things happen, then all of a sudden I'll be happy. If things work out the way that I want them to, if they work out the way that I'm planned or how I thought, then I'll be happy. It's what I call when-then thinking. When something happens, then I'll be happy. A couple things, when I get that new job, then I'll be happy. When I finally retire, then I'll be happy. When I have children, then I'll be happy. When the children finally leave, then I'll be really happy. But then we talk about, how this when-then even goes beyond that, and it goes in our financial world. When I move into that gated community, then I'll be happy. When I have a pension large enough that I can survive the rest of my life, then I'll be happy. When I drive that dream car, then I'll be happy. But think about all of those things, the when-thens, when this happens then. And that's kind of the force of where I'm trying to get at today, is that happiness is something that can come and go. And happiness is not what God wants us to root our independence, our desires of life through Him in. That God says that there's a bigger picture than what the world can bring in happiness. In fact, we learn through the writings of Solomon that Solomon said, I have everything in the world that a man could ever imagine, but yet I'm not happy. So happiness and joy are two specific different things. Happiness is contingent upon things in your control, things that you can do, external resources. But the question is, how do we find joy? Now here's a story about, understanding a little bit of happiness, because happiness, if things don't work out the way that you want, then you're not happy. If things don't happen the way that you've planned, then you're not happy. There was a man who was actually stranded on a desert island for 20 years. And all of a sudden, there was a company that came that wanted to develop this desert island into a vacation oasis, so to speak. So they come to this island, and all of a sudden, they discover this man who's been on that island for 20 years. And they come, and he's ecstatic. He's been found. He's been rescued. And they said, how have you survived all by yourself these 20 years? And the man said, come on, let me show you how it's all done. And they go through a bunch of the foliage of the island, and they get to a big clearing. And there are 3 man-made huts, 1, 2, and 3. And they're looking at them because they know this guy's been living on the island alone. They said, well, what's the deal with the huts? And the man says, well, that first hut, that's where I live. And that third hut, well, that's the church I attend. And they said, but what's the second hut for? He said, oh, that's the church I used to attend until I got mad. You see, that's the way it is for us, even with our churches, that our happiness is contingent upon external sources, external things being done, external things that are meeting the needs or whatever. But God says that our foundation has to be deeper and of greater credibility than just our mere happiness with what we see. C.S. Lewis writes this. Here's what C.S. Lewis says. He wrote this in Mere Christianity. He says, every time you make a choice, you're either turning the control part of you, the part that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, you are slowly turning the central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish beast. So by our choices, we're either turning ourselves into a heavenly creature or we're turning ourselves into a hellish beast. And the question boils down to, because we are chasing after something that the world predicts and the world sends its external resources called happiness, and that's why we find ourselves walking through life with troubles. The significant thing that we see here is it's all about attitude. And we have to learn how to have the right attitude. We have to be able to look at things and say that there is a difference between happiness and there's a difference between joy. And happiness is short-lived, and happiness can change, and happiness, depending upon what you say or I say or what we say to each other, can be a fleeting moment. But the Bible teaches something significant. The Bible says that God breathes joy into us. Let's go back to Psalm 100 for a second. Let's go back and look at this. Shout for the joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. So he's talking about shouting with joy, coming into the presence of God with gladness, but that gladness is not contingent upon being happy. It's dependent upon the joy that we have as we come into the presence of God and come before Him with joyful songs. Did you hear that? Joyful songs. It means when we sing to God that it's not about a genre or a song that we do, but it's the joy that we bring, knowing that we are singing to the Creator of the universe and singing with gladness. It is He who made us. We are His people, the sheep of His pasture. God created us, the Genesis story says, in His own image, which means God has created us not only with a sense of purpose, but God has created us by design for something greater than happiness. He's created us to have joy. Enter His gates with thanksgiving, His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him. Praise His name. For the Lord is good and His love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. Now that's a joyful piece right there, because what that says is that God doesn't just pick and choose which generation to pour out his joy, to pour out his favor. It's for all generations, and all generations receive the joy that comes from the Lord. But it boils back down to that choice thing again. Those times that you and I choose happiness over joy. And by choosing happiness, we find so many dynamics, even in our relationships, and James writes about one of them. He says that we fall out of happiness and we begin to argue and quarrel because someone didn't get their way. But God says, find joy. And earth that joy that comes within you, the gift that comes from the Lord. I love if we were to turn to Matthew chapter 5, we'd be learning about the Beatitudes this morning. And the Beatitudes are some significant teachings from Jesus. And Jesus begins to start teaching some specific points in the Beatitudes. If you hyphenate that word as in be-attitude, it's talking about being in the right attitude. It's talking about making the right choice. It's talking about looking beyond happiness and embracing the joy that comes from the Lord. And how do we know that? Because Jesus knew that you and I would struggle every day being in and out of happiness. There are times in our life that we just can't be happy. But he says, look beyond that and be joyful. Now he writes in the Beatitudes, he uses the word blessed. And the word blessed from the Old English vernacular actually means joyful. So if we take the Beatitudes and we work through even where he's saying be blessed, and we look at it through our own vernacular of the Old English, and we see that it means joyful, look at what it says. Joyful are you when you're poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Joyful are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Joyful are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Joyful are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Joyful are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Joyful are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Joyful are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons and daughters of God. Joyful are those who are persecuted because of my name's sake, and for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Joyful, blessed. Because of that, you are blessed, the joyfulness that comes from the Lord. You know, I look at this, and this is what Jesus does, because he gives us some very interesting teachings from the sense that it totally rocks the total opposite of what the world says. I mean, think about this. I'm supposed to be joyful when I mourn. I'm supposed to be joyful when I'm scorned. I'm supposed to be joyful when I'm hungry. I'm supposed to be joyful when people are kicking me to the curb. Come on. But he says that that's the difference. Because joy is found in the Lord. That even in the midst of those things where we might think those are bad things, that because God is in us, that we can be joyful in the midst of the challenges that come. Now, think about this with me for a second. Joy is something where God has infused his DNA. He's given it to us. Again, go back to the Genesis story, go back to what we just read in Psalm 100. God created us in his image. So the character of God is joy. It's not God's character is not built upon happiness. God's character is built upon joy. Because joy cannot be taken. Happiness can. And if we build upon the character of that, we understand. And we begin to realize if my life is built upon joy, if I am choosing to live in the joy that God has given to me, then everything that is external to my life doesn't matter. It cannot steal it. And I can see God in the midst of all of those troubled points because joy comes in the morning. Let me tell you a story about a guy by the name of Ira Yates. Ira Yates lived in West Texas, and he actually lived in the days of the Great Depression. And you know, I've talked to people who lived during those years of the Great Depression, and I've read a lot about it in my studies of American history and world history. And it was a very difficult time, not only for our country, but really for the world. And during that time, people were looking for things to eat. One man told me recently, he remembered as a little boy growing up in Illinois, that people would go and live under the bridges, and they would pull grass from under the bridges, and they would boil the grass to try to make soup just to have something to eat. He had a man approach him one time and said, "Son, does your mother have any food at home?" And he said, "Well, come on." And he took this man to the house, and the mother was not sure what to do. And he said, "Look, I'm here from 3 states over just looking for work. I just need something to eat so that I have the energy to do that." Difficult time. So it was with the life of Ira Yates, living in West Texas. And Ira Yates back then had a lot of acreage, like a lot of people did, but he was having a difficult time doing anything positive with that acreage, that pasture land, to actually earn money to feed his family. So what he did was he got some goats, and he got some sheep together that he had through the years, and he just turned them loose on this pasture land. And they began to eat, and he was hoping that through the fattening of those animals that ultimately the time would come where he might be able to sell one for some money to buy his kids shoes and clothes and things that just could not be made on the farm. Well, the time came that a company came from the seismographic company, and they came to Ira Yates's ranch land, and they said, "We want to be able to drill a wildcat well on your land because we're really kind of thinking something might be going on your land." So Ira Yates said, "Well, sure, go ahead. You can drill." And they began to drill, and the first well that they drilled was a wildcat. 80,000 barrels of oil a day. And Ira Yates' whole future began to change. And 50 years after they drilled that first well, they said that some of the wells that they've capped on that land, even in today, could still produce up to 125,000 barrels of oil a day. You see, all along, Ira Yates had everything he needed. He had joy in that he had been blessed with something that he didn't know that he had. And yet he was living his life of obscurity. He was living his life of difficulty. And all of a sudden, the blessing came. And that's the way it is for you and me. That the joy that God has given to us has been infused in us. We've had it all along. Everything we need to make life to its fullest extent, God has given to us through a joyful spirit and a joyful heart. And therefore, no matter what we're going through, we can see God in the midst of our joy. Well, I was thinking a little bit this week, what's the best way to kind of depict what joy could look like? And I started scratching my head, and I said, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So what does it look like to see God in our joy? Watch this.
Hello, baby.